Greetings. This is session 19 of Black Theology, Black Church, the African American Religious Experience. I'm Dr. Jones. We are going to continue our journey in reviewing the African American Church and the African American Religious Experience. Today we're going to talk about Malcolm X and a bit about Martin Luther King. We're going to compare the two men in relationship to the theologies that they present. I'm going to give you a little information about Malcolm X's background, and then we're going to look at Martin's background, and we're going to do some comparisons of their theology and their positions on social justice. So, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King both spoke to issues in the public arena during the 1950s and 1960s. Both careers of Malcolm and Martin lasted 13 years. Both men died at 39. Both men were murdered. Both men were known more widely acclaimed in death than in life. And so it's a very interesting kind of thing that has happened to African American leadership. And we need to look at these two leaders because they are kind of the central focus of the development of the civil rights movement during the late 1950s, early 60s, mid-60s. We're going to take a look at their lives, and then we're going to look at how their theologies impacted the African American religious experience. Okay, Malcolm X. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little, May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. He was one of 8 children born to Earl and Louise Little. Malcolm's father, Earl, was a Baptist preacher and a follower of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association. Malcolm's father was murdered by a domestic terrorist group, a racist group called the Black Legion in Lansing, Michigan, after the family moved away from Omaha, Nebraska, when the KKK firebombed their home. The death of Malcolm X's father resulted in the breakup of his family. His family was basically put in foster care. In 1937, his mother was confined to a mental institution, and the children became wards of the state. His mother was confined for 26 years, and the family literally was fragmented and put into different homes. Malcolm stayed briefly with his stepsister Ella in Boston, Massachusetts, kind of got involved into the fast community there, the club community there, and he became kind of a, I would say, a low-level hustler, low-level kind of street urchin kind of guy that did various things in order to, survive. And Malcolm stayed in Boston for a few years. Then a job brought him to New York. He got caught up into criminal activity there and was imprisoned in 1946. Malcolm's brother, Reginald, wrote Malcolm in prison and encouraged him toward Islam. He basically told Malcolm, he said, stop eating pork, stop smoking, and kind of focus your attention on getting yourself together. And he said, this will begin a journey for you to come out of prison. And Malcolm was desperately trying to get out of prison at this particular time in his life. He meets a character, inmate in prison, Bimby. A fellow inmate shared self-taught knowledge. Bimby was a self-educated gentleman. Malcolm used to read the dictionary from A to Z, and he was a voracious reader. He would read everything he'd get his hands on. He taught knowledge about religion to Malcolm. Malcolm at first was very much an atheist. In fact, he had a nickname in prison called Satan. Because he was so against religion, in particular Christianity, but all religions in general. But with Bimby, he began to understand that religion was a much more complex kinds of issue, and he began to change his attitude toward religion. This prepared Malcolm to receive his brother's message about Islam, and so Malcolm X's conversion happened in 1948. The year King was ordained and entered into Koser Seminary. Malcolm X's social life was different than Martin King Jr. He grew up poor and in a violent household and a violent environment. Malcolm X's family experienced the full brunt of hate and discrimination produced by Western Europeans through hate groups. The KKK burned down his home. in Nebraska. This hate group in Lansing, Michigan, kills his father, throws him under a streetcar. He had always experienced being a minority inside the school system. In fact, Malcolm recounts in the autobiography of Malcolm X how he heard the word nigger so much that he just got used to hearing it. Although he was looked up to by his white counterparts in school, he was a very intelligent young man. He was able to lead them. In fact, I'm going to post in behind this lecture, I want you to watch Make It Plain, which is a documentary dealing with the life of Malcolm X, and you'll be able to see in detail the kind of development of Malcolm as an individual. His life is a testimony to the resilient nature of the African-American males caught in the vicious cycle of racism in American culture, American society. Malcolm's theology is based on certain objectives and goals for social justice, and he basically had 5 objectives that he put into theological terms based on his understanding of the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, but also understanding of the teachings of Islam and the Quran. Because he was American black, he had to deal with the issue of institutional racism. So here's his 5 objectives: unity, self-knowledge, self-love, self-defense, and separation. Unity, self-knowledge, self-love, self-defense, and separation. This was basically the social justice objectives of Malcolm X. So when you listen to Malcolm X, people hear a lot of rage, but it's not a lot of rage. It's not as much rage as you would think. I mean, when you look at authors, when you look at Cone's work, and you look at others' work in terms of Malcolm and Martin, Malcolm is always purported to be the one that is full of anger and full of rage, and he's not. He's simply speaking very matter-of-factly about a condition of racism in American culture, American society. He says specifically this, and this is what I get out of Malcolm X. Why would you want to integrate with somebody who didn't see you as a human being? First, find out who you are. Find out what your culture is, what your contribution is to global community, and then negotiate human to human with Europeans. But don't get involved with this whole mamby-pamby, I love you, you love me, when people have already designated you as less than human. So Malcolm X was a very anointed young man. He had a beautiful spirit about him, had a wonderful smile. He had a sense of humor. He understood, but he was very sharp intellectually, and he was not buying what was being sold at that time about the American Negro by the Western European culture. He just wasn't buying it. And so he comes up at a very poignant and prophetic time in the development of the Civil Rights Movement and giving leadership to a segment of the African American community. Primarily, he gives leadership to the masses of poor African Americans in American culture, American society. Okay, so that's Malcolm X. Now, what we want to do is we want to look at Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was born on January 15th, 1929. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia, to Alberta Christine Williams and Martin Luther King Sr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born into a family of preachers who served at the influential middle-class Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. The black middle-class church sought to change the conditions of African Americans through basically protests, accommodation, and self-help, using the strategy of the NAACP, Booker T. Washington, and Frederick Douglass. The NAACP as the instrument of protest, Booker T. Washington's up from slavery, I believe, for self-help, and accommodationist and integrationist strategies brought on by the teachings of Frederick Douglass. The Southern black middle class thought success in education, morality, and business would cause whites to accept them as human beings. And they felt that they could get the support of the white elite. This is the leadership tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. and what he inherited. In other words, he inherited an environment by which people felt that you could get the support of the white elite by being more moral, by having economics or good business sense, and being educated. Christian obedience, and God helps those who helps themselves. Martin Luther King Jr. really thought the African American middle class community could convince whites in America to end racism and discrimination. He was basically raised as a preacher's son. He grew up in Bible study. He grew up in a middle class environment, went to Morehouse College. He did a lot of traveling. There's even a segment in Cone's book where he throws back his head and he begins to quote various European poets, and he begins to, there's a segment in Cone's work where he talks about Martin Luther King is driving in his limousine and he's basically listening to classical music, and he's just talking about how wonderful classical music it is. So he's very influenced by American culture and American society. He has a Protestant tradition, but he also has this middle classness that's very much a part of his life. And there is a large segment of African Americans who are buying into or have bought into accommodation, protest, and integration as a way to change their conditions in American culture and American society. I want you to pay attention to how the society of African Americans is beginning to divide now by class and by attitude in terms of dealing with Western Europeans. Martin Luther King Jr. felt that the teachings of Jesus Christ and the teachings of Gandhi essentially would dismantle the institutional racism in America. Using his black middle class status and tactics of protest, accommodation, and integrationalist methodology, Dr. King felt that the nationalist values of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant core ethic would be redesigned by this moral and ethical teaching, and that the imbalances that showed in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant core ethic imbalances could be affected by the teachings of Jesus Christ, the teachings of Gandhi, and this whole attitude of accommodationist. In other words, if African Americans show whites that they don't need to be afraid of them, that they could be like them, that they could be part of mainstream culture, then whites would lose their fear and eventually accept. That was his historic understanding of America. King fits firmly within this notion of mainstream church community and culture. Remember, I talked to you about mainstream community and advocacy cultures, church cultures. The mainstream culture is where King fits firmly in. His idea and the way that he was raised was that you work hard, you stay out of trouble, and you become a moral voice for the people based on your behavior and based on how white people accepted you. The theology of Martin Luther King sits within the context of agape love, unconditional love and behavior. If we stay obedient to the teachings of Christ, agape love will win over the forces of hate and discrimination. Remember, the mainstream church wants to be accepted within European American community. Now, Martin Luther King's attitude about social justice is very different from Malcolm X, and that's kind of where we're going to look at. Martin Luther King's Jr.'s 5 social justice objectives, and they're theologically based as well, is self-respect, high moral standards, wholehearted work ethic, leadership, and nonviolence. Self-respect, I'll say them again, high moral standards, wholehearted work ethic, leadership, and nonviolence. Both of these individuals have the same goals. They're pursuing the same goals. Both of these, Malcolm and Martin King, sought justice. Both were intelligent, sensitive, spiritual black men, African American men. Both were victims of violent murder for caring about African American people. They both were murdered because they cared about black people. Let's look at some of the more profound parallels of these two leaders within the civil rights movement. You know, the parallels of these men are almost mystical in terms of the way that they move through history. As I said in the beginning, both spoke to the issue of public events. Both careers lasted 13 years. Both men died at 39. Both men were murdered. Both men were known more widely acclaimed in death than in life. And so their lives were parallel to one another, although Malcolm was unabashedly, he was brutally honest in terms of how he dealt with, and he had the kind of logic in terms of dealing with the insanity of institutional racism that just drove the white community to distraction. People really couldn't handle the truth-telling of Malcolm X, and you'll see that when you watch the video and make it plain. Martin committed to giving his life to the development of an attitude of caring for white people. Seeing, if you listen to his speeches, and I will post some of his speeches as well. He talks about his disappointment in America. He talks about America has rescinded their ideology or their principles, trying to continue this road of racism. So as we move into next time, and our next lecture will be dealing with the civil rights movement, I want you to be well aware of these two famous and important African-American men, religious men, in the African-American religious experience. Keep in mind, and this is the last part, that both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were theologians, and they approached the issue of justice in a parallel way, but from very different journeys. Martin was middle class. Malcolm grew up in the masses of poor people, but they both had important stories to tell. I'll see you next time.